Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 8, explored the relationship between slavery, growing North-South divisions, and westward expansion that led to the outbreak of the Civil War. In particular, we're looking at Part E of that standard, evaluate the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the failure of popular sovereignty, Scott versus Sanford, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and the election of 1860 as events leading to the Civil War. Four issues in the last years of the 1850s further divided the nation over the issue of slavery and pushed the North and South into the Civil War. The issues were political in nature, and some involved increasing violence. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an unsuccessful attempt to use popular sovereignty to solve the slavery question. The Supreme Court in Scott versus Sanford effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry marked an escalation in violence over the slavery issue. These events highlight the mounting sectional division. The trigger event that prompted the outbreak of the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln's Republican victory in the presidential election of 1860. No single event is responsible for the Civil War, but rather the cumulative effect of many events that led to the Civil War. The rich farmlands west of Missouri enticed families and investors. In 1852 and 1853, Congress considered creating the territories of Nebraska and Kansas for settlement. The legislation caught the attention of Southern congressmen who refused to even consider creating new territories unless a provision was made that Southerners could bring slaves to the region. Northern representatives argued, though, that bringing slavery into those new territories would actually violate the Missouri Compromise because those territories were above the line that the Missouri Compromise set to divide free and slave states. In 1854, Congress again took up the issue of slavery in proposed states and territories. Stephen A. Douglas included a provision using popular sovereignty, meaning rule by the people, where citizens would actually be allowed in that territory to decide on whether or not slavery would be allowed or if slavery would be prohibited. Basically, popular sovereignty was people would vote on whether or not slavery would or wouldn't be allowed. Southerners hoped that by allowing the people to decide on the issue of slavery, that more slave states could be added. After a great deal of debate in both houses, the bill was passed as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act had several effects. First, the law essentially repealed, so overturned, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. Settlers in all new territories would have the right to decide on whether or not their new home was going to be a free or a slave state. The previous compromises that decided whether or not new territories were going to form as a free or a slave state were overturned by the more democratic sounding approach of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act's second effect was that pro and anti-slavery groups hurried to those territories to try to establish a voting majority there. Anti-slavery abolitionists came from eastern states. Pro-slavery settlers came from neighboring state Missouri. Some of the pro-slavery supporters settled in Kansas, while many essentially stayed long enough to vote for slavery and then returned home to Missouri. Pro-slavery voters elected a legislature ready to make Kansas a slave state. Abolitionists then elected a rival Kansas government wrote an anti-slavery constitution, established a different capital city, and raised an army. The pro-slavery people responded by raising their own army. Violence between the two sides erupted, created these warlike conditions, and then made people refer to the territory as Bleeding Kansas. Popular sovereignty had failed. Letting the people decide had failed. The third effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was that it split existing political parties into regional factions and gave rise to the new Republican Party. The new party developed after President Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act into law. Opposition to slavery was the common cause that attracted people to the Republican Party. The groups that came together to make up the new party included members of the Free Soil Party, whose main platform was the opposition to the expansion of slavery. Disgruntled followers of the existing political parties, anti-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats, joined the Free Soilers in creating the new Republican Party. President Pierce's inability to control the violence in Kansas led to his defeat in the presidential election of 1856. However, the Republicans were gaining momentum. So too was Abraham Lincoln, who was soon to be the Republican Party's star candidate. Another event that led the country toward the Civil War was the Supreme Court ruling in the Scott v. Sanford case. Often referred to as the Dred Scott decision, the 1857 ruling settled a dispute where a slave named Dred Scott claimed he should be a free man. Scott had lived with his master in free and slave states and believed he had been held illegally in free states. The Supreme Court rejected Scott's claim on the basis that no enslaved or free black could be a citizen of the United States. The court said that Congress could not prohibit slavery in federal territories. Therefore, the court found that popular sovereignty and the Missouri Compromise of 1820 were unconstitutional. The Dred Scott decision gave slavery the protection of the U.S. Constitution. Basically, nothing short of a constitutional amendment could end slavery, an event not likely to occur. Pro-slavery Americans welcomed the decision by the court, feeling justified that they had been on the right side of the slavery issue and abolitionists on the wrong side. In contrast, abolitionists convinced state legislatures to declare the Dred Scott decision as not binding within their state borders. The new Republican Party said that if its candidate were elected in 1860, they would appoint a new court that would reverse the Dred Scott decision. Violence over slavery escalated as political maneuvering wasn't creating a lasting policy on the issue. John Brown's raid is another event that led to the Civil War. John Brown, a hardcore abolitionist, decided to fight slavery with violence and killing. In 1856, believing he was chosen by God to end slavery, he commanded family members and other abolitionists to attack pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, killing 5 men. Leaving Kansas, Brown decided to begin a slave war in the East by seizing arms and munitions and leading slaves in rebellion. In 1859, John Brown led a group of white and black men on a raid of a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in hopes of arming slaves for a rebellion. The raid failed, and U.S. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, captured Brown. Eventually, Brown was convicted of treason against the state of Virginia and executed by hanging. At first, many Northerners and Southerners were horrified by Brown's actions. Eventually, many Northerners had come to respect what Brown had done, viewing him as a martyr for the abolitionist movement. Southerners were angered. Many in the South viewed Brown as a terrorist killer ready to start this slave rebellion that would have led to the death of hundreds of men, women, and children. Vocal Northern support of Brown's actions did little to calm an anxious South. Thinking back to the Nat Turner Rebellion 20 years earlier, Southern states began to strengthen and train their state militias. A war between the North and South was beginning to become a real possibility. The trigger that set the Civil War in motion was the victory of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois, while the Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge of Kentucky to be the nominees in the presidential election of 1860. Some of the old Whigs who didn't support either Democrat candidate or the Republican candidate formed the Constitutional Union Party and nominated John Bell of Tennessee to be their candidate. The field was full with 4 candidates for the November election. Their positions on slavery were important to the outcome of the election. Lincoln believed that slavery should not be allowed to expand to the territories, but he would not interfere in the states where slavery already existed. Douglas believed popular sovereignty should be the policy regarding slavery. Breckinridge viewed slaves as property, therefore the government could not deny citizens the right to their property regardless of their location. Bell did not commit to a position regarding slavery, but maintained his main importance of preserving the Union of the United States. The final votes in the election fell along regional lines, with Lincoln carrying the more populated North and thus the Electoral College. Upon Lincoln's election, South Carolina voted to secede from the United States. Secede, separate from. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas followed South Carolina's lead to break away from the United States. These lower South states were the original 7 members of the Confederate States of America. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina also joined the Confederacy. All of the events of the 1850s contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War, but it was the election of Lincoln that triggered its actual beginning.